So today we are going to do a little review on the passive voice. But this can be a tricky concept, even in English. So before we dive into what it's going to look like in Latin, I want to make sure we're fully up to date on how the passive voice works in English. All right. Every verb we've done up to now has been in the active voice. But now we're going to learn about the passive voice. Oh, and before you learn any new topic, I always recommend that you retrieve your prior knowledge. See where you're at, right? Try and think about what do you know about the passive voice. Have you ever heard about it in an English class? Try and maybe write a sentence in the passive voice. What's the difference between the passive and the active voice? Blank page retrieval, all right? So when you pause the video, spend about 2 minutes retrieving and really do this. A reminder, this is how we learn. So don't cheat yourself with this retrieval. Alright, so moving forward, I don't know what you wrote. Hopefully there's some good stuff in here. In order so that we can be on the same page, I wrote out some examples. Some of these sentences are passive, some of these are active. Okay, so why don't you pause the video to start off and see if you can identify which ones are passive and which ones are active. You can copy it down to your notebook and write a P or an A next to the sentence. Or you can just, write a P and an A as you go. Like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, just to keep track to see if your answers are right. Alright, why don't you pause the video and do that now? Okay, so now that you've tried on your own, I'm going to give you a little hint and see if that's going to change your answers at all. The big tagline with the active and passive voice is that in the active voice, the subject, or in Latin, the nominative subject, in the active, does the action of the verb. In the passive voice, that nominative subject receives the action of the verb. Okay? So keeping that in mind, ask yourself, which of these sentences is in the passive? In which sentences does the subject receive the verb? And in which sentences is the subject doing the verb? Alright, pause the video and see if you want to correct any of your answers. Moving on. Alright, I've highlighted which ones, the passive or the active? I've highlighted the passive verbs, okay? So notice in sentence number 1, the boy hits, the boy is doing the action, so the subject is doing the action, so it's active. Sentence number 2, the girl is the subject, she's receiving the action, so it's passive. The sailor slashes, the sailor is doing the action, active. We are loved, what's our subject? We. Is it doing or receiving the action? Receiving. So it's passive. You call. Doing or receiving the action. You are calling. So you're doing it. It's active. And finally, sons are held. The sons are being held. They're receiving the action of hold. So the sons are, so that sentence is in the passive voice. And are held is a passive verb. Alright? Good. So, moving on to the key tagline. If you haven't written this down in your notebook, you should. This is going to be what we're going to drill into our heads. It's going to make our lives much easier if we understand this basic tagline. Alright? So say it aloud to yourself a couple times now. Alright. So now what I want you to do is these are the same sentences we looked at before. I want you to take these sentences and change them from whatever voice they're in, whether it's active or passive, and switch the voice while keeping the subject the same. So an example is, the boy hits is in the active voice, right? So the subject is boy and it's doing the action. If I want to make it passive, I now need the boy to receive the action of the verb hits. So what am I going to write? The boy is hit. Now he's the one receiving the action rather than doing it. Okay? Alright, let's take a crack at that. Oh, sorry. Pause the video and do it, and then I'll show you the answers. Alright? Here are the answers. Again, remember, I'm just changing it so now that the nominative subject is doing the inverse of what it was before, right? When it was active, it was doing it. so I made it the nominative subject receive it. If it was passive, it was receiving it. So in my new sentence, I made the subject do the action. Read these over, see if they match up with the answers you got, and keep note of any things you don't understand for class. All right, we're going to end with some practice where I'm not going to give you the answers, and I want you to write out the translation of these forms. All right, but before we do that, I do want to just look at one more thing. When we look at this verb, the sailor is slashed. We now know, right, it's in the passive voice, so we know who's receiving the action. But we don't know who's doing the action. So one of the answers that we're going to be looking to resolve in class on Thursday is how do we say who the sailor was slashed by in Latin and in English, right? And the other question is, well, in the active voice, the girl sees the boy. The boy was my accusative direct object because it receives the action of the verb. But in the passive, if the nominative subject is receiving the action of the verb, what are we going to use? Is there going to be an accusative? Do we need an accusative direct object? Will it exist? All questions to be answered on Thursday. For now, please try and answer these questions, including this stretch at the end. These, you're just doing what we were doing before, where you're just keeping the words in the sentence the same. You're just making the subject, you're changing the verb from active to passive. In the stretch, I want you to keep the meaning of the sentence the same. So you might not keep the same subject. You might have to change your subject and change the roles of the sentence. I just want you to make this sentence meaning the same, but write it in the active voice rather than the passive voice. And that's tough, but try and see if you can figure it out. All right, hope this was helpful, and we'll pick up what the passive voice looks like in Latin on Thursday.